everyone. So, what I'm going to be talking about is just finishing up the content from the developmental psychology chapter. So, I'll be focusing on adolescence through the rest of the human lifespan. So, hopefully, this one's a little bit shorter than the last one. Not as much content to get through. Basically, we're going to be hitting the physical development that we undergo when we hit puberty, the cognitive changes that happen once you reach this developmental stage, the social changes that take place. I'll briefly cover an interesting period in the lifespan that has been more recently identified as maybe a slightly new transitional period of what we call emerging adulthood, and then briefly cover everything that comes after. So, in terms of the physical development of puberty, a lot of the changes that we undergo are geared towards getting us towards the state of sexual maturation. It's basically our bodies getting us ready to reproduce and to have children. This is done via the mechanisms of increased sex hormones, which lead to the increase of both primary and secondary sex characteristics, which I'll show you in a second. These sex hormones do tend to have psychological consequences and do tend to change things like our mood and behavior. Anyone who's gone through puberty and sort of went through that experience of a lot of turmoil and a lot of conflicting feelings and a lot of difficulty transitioning could attest to the fact that all of these changes do exact some psychological distress or discomfort. So, in terms of the sex characteristic changes that we see, when you say primary sex characteristics changing, these are changes to the reproductive organs themselves. So, this is when women begin their period and are thus able to conceive. The body goes through a series of secondary sex characteristic changes as well. So these are the changes that you tend to see that don't have to do with your actual reproductive organs changing. Things like your voice changing, women develop breasts, men develop facial hair, voices changing. So all of these changes take place in a relatively predictable sequence, but the time of onset is not necessarily going to be the same person to person. Some research indicates that puberty might be happening earlier in life than it has in the past. This might be due to cultural factors, interestingly. It might be the case that individuals from wealthier countries may start to see puberty onset being slightly earlier. There's no exact explanation for why that might be the case, but it certainly is normal for individuals to experience the onset of puberty at slightly different times. The sequence of what happens once the body undergoes this process, though, is relatively predictable. So while your body is undergoing all of these changes, your brain is also going to be undergoing quite a bit of change as well. So, as I mentioned in the last lecture, when you're born, you have the most amount of brain cells and brain connections as you ever will have over the lifespan. But basically, the process of growing up and becoming a functioning adult is your brain starts to prune away the brain cell connections that are unnecessary. So, you actually do see quite a bit of synaptic pruning whereby the brain in adolescence stops adding new connections and really just hones in on the existing connections. And so you do see an increase in the myelin insulating coating around your synapses, but you do see that the brain undergoes this process of pruning. The idea is that the brain is trying to make itself more effective by cutting unnecessary, superfluous connections. So the brain is sort of on the route to becoming the more efficient machine that it can be. So this is a really interesting time for learning. The brain is undergoing a lot of changes and becoming more effective by undergoing all the necessary pruning to cut all the dead weight. Interestingly, you do see that in particular, the frontal lobes of the adolescent brain sort of are the last to undergo this process of getting to its final pruned or rewired state. So the frontal lobes, which as we learned when we talked about biopsych, has to do with long-term planning, self-control, personality. This tends to be the brain area that sort of gets to the finish last. So this has some critical implications for things like ability to control impulsive behavior and to make good decisions. Adolescence is a time when often the sway of rewards outweigh the consequences. And this can definitely cause teenagers and adolescents to engage in a lot more risky and dumb behavior. So, the idea that teens might behave in more reckless ways, there is some research supporting this, and there is a brain based explanation for why this might be the case. So, it's a phase that adolescents go through. The idea is that it's their brain wiring that, in a certain sense, is affecting their ability to make what we as adults would consider the wise or correct decision. It's just that they're sort of perceiving the world in a slightly different way because their brain is at a particular stage of development. In terms of cognitive development, as discussed in the Piaget model of cognitive stages, we would consider adolescence to be in that final Piaget esque stage of formal operational. So, in terms of cognitive development, teens and adolescents start to be able to engage in the more abstract kind of thinking that is challenging or impossible for younger children. So we can start to reason things in an abstract way. Teens can start to think about how the idealized version of the world or what they want for themselves compares to reality, and they can think about long term goals. They can weigh through what the consequences of their choices might be, despite the fact that they might not always make what one would consider the ideal decision. Adolescents at this stage can start to weigh abstract decisions and come to that sort of conclusion about what the best choice would be in order to pursue their goals. Theory of mind has been developed at this point, so an understanding that others have different perspectives from your own. These are all these sort of cognitive um, milestones that we achieve through these various Piaget-esque stages. So again, adolescents aren't necessarily at a perfect working understanding of the world, but it's at this stage that their cognitive powers have finally reached this formal operational stage, and they are capable of the more abstract, long-term, metaphorical sorts of thinking. Adolescence is going to be the age when we see moral reasoning start to develop into something more akin to what adults might use as moral justification or reasoning. So, morality is going to be a system by which you understand what behaviors are correct and what behaviors are wrong, just your sense of right and wrong. We've all got a sense of right and wrong that we've developed through experiences and through our own understanding of our ideals and what we think to be the right thing to do. So, morality, when you're a young child, a lot of it comes from your idea of what behaviors are you punished for and what behaviors are you rewarded for. It's a very simplistic moral reasoning scheme. Now, adolescents are in a stage where they can use their moral reasoning in more abstract ways. So it might not just be the case that someone in the adolescent stage is coming to a conclusion about what's right and wrong based on their experiences of reward and punishment. It might be driven from this internal emotional sense or what we term moral emotions. There's various theories about what moral emotions exist, but a really basic one is, for example, disgust. Disgust is what we call a moral emotion. Disgust at something that's like repulsive, like rotten food, is one thing, but disgust is also an emotion we feel when we observe or think about a behavior that we find repugnant or immoral. So, this feeling of disgust that we naturally have when we observe someone doing something that harms another person, something that violates our moral code, it may be the case that at the adolescent stage, teens are able to feel this sense of moral disgust and it helps them develop their sense of what's right and what's wrong. Additionally, there are positive moral emotions, what we would term elevated feelings. So, something like the rewarding feeling you get when you do the right thing, when you help out someone that needs it, when you donate to charity. Something like awe or wonder, the idea that some things are right because they inspire an elevated feeling, maybe akin to a sort of a spiritual awe or just a sort of a natural wonderment at the world. These again would be what we term moral emotions, and they're the kinds of feelings that once we reach this adolescent stage, we're capable of a sort of a more fine-tuned sense of moral reasoning, and teens start to have these feelings. So there are various theories of moral reasoning, and one famous one is Lawrence Kohlberg's theorized levels of moral reasoning. Now, his levels of moral reasoning, the actual empirical support is sort of not all there. There's some support, there's some research that refutes that the stages work exactly in this way, but there's at least some evidence that Kohlberg's understanding of levels of moral reasoning do have a fair amount of support. Whether or not the stages are as strictly defined in terms of the actual ages, not so much support for that, but there is some support for the fact that the level of abstraction in the moral reasoning that various ages can achieve does somewhat vary. So he termed what we call pre-conventional morality. So this, as I somewhat alluded to earlier, young children develop a very simplistic black and white moral code. The idea that morality and right and wrong is just a function of what things you are rewarded for and what things you're punished for. So it's not really a broader universal sense of right and wrong. It's just basically don't do the things that would cause you to get in trouble. From there, he theorized that once children get a little bit older, they develop a slightly more advanced, what we call conventional morality. So, this is the idea that there are reasons to follow rules, even if you don't necessarily run the risk of getting caught, but because it's better pro socially and it's better for social functioning if we all go along together to do the right thing. So, the idea that you want to make sure that we all function together, that we all can get along, and so for that reason, you should follow the rules, even if you wouldn't necessarily get caught. Now, a post-conventional morality that Kohlberg theorized some achieve later in adolescence and adulthood. This is a sense of morality where sometimes you have to engage in behavior that goes against the specified rules of legal conduct for a higher purpose. So I know the example that the book set forth was, for example, is a man justified in robbing a pharmacy that was overcharging for a medication to save his wife's life? If the pharmacy was charging more than the man could afford, the idea is that there might be a moral justification for the man robbing the pharmacy if it was for the greater good of saving a life. So this sort of post-conventional morality, it's the sort of ethical reasoning that rises above the idea that you need to follow the letter of the law. It's the idea that sometimes there's higher purposes, things like saving lives. Something like that can override rules like don't steal. So the idea that sometimes you need to weigh what's the greater good, and in doing so, somewhat break all the lower level rules. Now, his Kohlberg's idea was that we would achieve this stage of moral reasoning at a certain point later in adolescence and into adulthood. There's some indication that really not everyone even necessarily achieves this level of moral reasoning. And I would say ethically, you could say to yourself that it's just sort of doesn't adhere to your moral code, the idea that sometimes you need to break some rules to achieve a higher purpose. I would say, again, the support for this theory is that these do appear to be certain moral stages that can only be achieved at certain developmental stages. But whether or not we all achieve these stages at particular time periods, there's not so much evidence for this, but there definitely is evidence that these levels of abstraction of thinking about morality are only capable as you develop further. A different theory about stages of development by Erik Erikson has to do with what we call social development. So this is a bit of a departure from this moral reasoning development I was just talking about. So Erik Erikson had a slightly different developmental framework where he framed various sequential developmental stages as being a series of problems or issues that one confronts and needs to resolve before one is able to move on to the next stage that has its own subsequent issue to be resolved. So he basically mapped out the human life as a series of issues that needed to be met and needed to be resolved. So, for example, when we're infants, the basic question that we are grappling with, not really in a cognitive sense, but just sort of how we're encountering the world, is whether or not we can trust the people around us to keep us safe and secure. So if an infant grows up in a loving, warm, supportive, affectionate home and environment with caregivers that love them, the infant's going to make it through this trust versus mistrust stage by believing that generally he or she can be a trusting person. Again, the idea is that if an infant comes through this stage and finds that the trust side is more so going to be true about the world, they come through this stage successfully. So again, Erikson proposed that there's various ages at which there's different issues that must be resolved, and only through the successful resolution of these issues can you successfully make it on to the next stage. Now, this is an interesting theory, and I do think that it does get at something that rings true, the idea that there are sort of fundamental issues that we grapple with throughout the years. But again, this would be a theory that isn't necessarily entirely supported by the research. It doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that all of us follow this very exact path and that we all grapple with the same exact questions and issues in the same exact stages. Certainly, there is a fair amount of research, though, focusing back in on adolescence, that one of the key struggles that we deal with in our teenage years is this idea that we're starting in this stage to grapple with the idea that we are able to construct our own identity. The idea that the responsibility falls on us to construct an identity, a personhood, a persona, all our own. So Erikson suggested that the major issue to be resolved at the adolescent stage was whether or not we forge forward, creating our own individual, authentic identity, or if we just fall back on the roles and ideas that other people have about us, these sort of external ideas about what we should do. So, for example, a struggle adolescents might grapple with at this stage is whether there's a discrepancy between who they want to be and maybe who their parents expect them to be. And if there's conflict between who you want to be and who your parents want you to be, it can lead to a great sense of difficulty, and it can lead to a lot of internal struggles and turmoil. So again, broadly, Erikson's framework is not necessarily empirically supported top to bottom, but certainly it does have empirical support that adolescence is a transitional time where identity issues are a big psychosocial issue that we grapple with. So, social development in the adolescent stage, right? As I mentioned, Erikson theorized that adolescence is all about this struggle to forge your own identity or sense of self. So, this is when, really, for the first time, we can think more abstractly about who we want to be. We can start to think about our identity, how we affiliate, how we label ourselves, the kind of person that we are, and the kind of person we want to become. So, this is a stage when teens are going to largely be a bit experimental in terms of trying out new senses of self and new identities. It might be the case that the adolescent years, you start to think about the kind of persona, the kind of person you want to be. And it might seem like a sort of a simplistic worldview to label yourself in this sort of stereotypical way, but this is a sort of a normal struggle that adolescents go through. The idea that maybe you want to develop a different identity of yourself with your peers, and you want to try being a different version of yourself with your friends than you might be with your parents or your teachers. And try out these different forms of yourself, sort of try on different hats to see what feels right, what feels true about you, what makes you happy. Again, Despite the fact that Erickson's theory is not empirically supported top to bottom, that we all necessarily follow those exact psychosocial stages, there's definitely support for this identity crisis that a lot of people go through in the adolescent stage. Now, it's not necessarily to say that every person who reaches this stage will struggle greatly. For some people, their sense of self aligns with what other people believe to be true about themselves. So, if what you want for yourself does end up mapping onto what your parents want from you, it might be that you make it through this stage with minimal struggle. Again, if it's the case that your sense of self is a great departure from what your parents or others might want from you or expect from you, it might be the case that this stage is just more of a struggle and it takes more effort to come through this stage unscathed. Additionally, this is going to be a very unique time in the human lifespan because this is going to be, for most, the stage in which we develop a capacity for intimacy and start to develop romantic relationships. So, most teens report being in a romantic relationship at some point during that time span. It's, for a lot of people, the first romantic or sexual relationship you'll have over the course of the lifespan. So, this is going to be another part of the struggle of the adolescent stage. The idea that you're forging this new identity and a new part of your identity is going to be formed, your ability to have romantic relationships. So, interestingly, at the adolescent stage, part of what might be responsible for some of the difficulties, some of the identity struggles, the idea that when you're younger, it's really primarily going to be your parents or caregivers that are going to be influential on who you are and your identity. When you're a younger child, you spend a lot more time with your family and with your caregivers. It's certainly the case that as we grow into adolescence, people spend more and more time with their peers and less time with their parents. And again, this is going to be a difficult period where you're going through a lot of physical changes, you're going through a lot of social changes. And so, as we grow through the adolescent stage, we do see that children and teens do tend to have more time spent with their peers, and they tend to have a lot more of their identity be associated with those peer relationships. This is a pretty natural progression, having more time with your peers, with your friends, and replacing time that you used to spend with your parents. But again, this might be part of what causes a little bit of a struggle and a little bit of a sense of your identity being in flux. Okay, so moving on to the next stage of what we would call emerging adulthood. Now, previously, developmental theorists sort of considered everyone over the age of 18 to basically be an adult. We do know that further physical and brain development does continue on until about the age of 25. So, the idea of there being some strict cutoff whereby at the age of 18 you're an adult and adulthood is its own unique stage. Certainly, it does appear that we need a little bit more granularity than that. We do need to specify the different stages of adulthood. So, for example, some theorists have suggested that we need to account for a whole new developmental stage of what we call emerging adulthood. So, this is more of a transitional stage whereby you're out of the traditional adolescent stage. So, you are a legal adult at the age of 18, and so you do have full legal rights and you are technically considered an adult. But it certainly is the case that more and more, and particularly in westernized cultures, there's a new stage where you're after the age of 18, but you're still not as fully independent as you might be. So, examples of how this is playing out, more and more people are continuing to live with their parents past the age of 18. More people are putting off marriage and children to a later age, particularly given societal factors like, for example, the recession that happened in 2008, the increase of student debt responsibilities. A whole host of societal factors may account for why this emerging adulthood stage seems to have developed. For whatever reason, certainly we're seeing that for a lot more individuals, particularly in the American culture and other Western cultures, that this is a sort of a new time period that appears to have its own unique properties that is a bit of a departure from what we would consider traditional adulthood. No shame in that. So then, when you achieve adulthood, this is what we would consider a stage at which you are fully developed and you're more fully independent, and you are independent in various ways from your caregivers and your parents. So, adulthood is going to be a stage where still a lot of things happen, despite the fact that you're done developing in a physical sense and your body and your brain over the majority of adulthood is going to be relatively stable. This is going to be a period where, for many of us, we undergo a series of really huge life changes. So, despite the fact that we might feel like we reach adulthood and we sort of should have it all together because we're done developing and we should be independent, thinking about all the major changes that happen over the course of a normal adulthood, things like living alone for the first time, starting a career for the first time for most of us, going beyond just working random odd jobs in the summer in between school, the idea that you're beginning a job that you might have for the rest of your working life. For many of us, we'll get into a long term relationship and get married and begin to have children. So these are all major life transitions that have the possibility to cause a significant amount of stress, that have a significant sway on our happiness and our life satisfaction. So despite the fact that adulthood is typically thought of as a stage in which there would be more stability, thinking about all of the major life transitions that occur, this is still going to be a stage where developmentally we're going through a lot, and our psychological state is going to be in a little bit of flux depending on what sort of major life transitions we're undergoing. Now, one misconception about the adulthood stage is that at a certain point around, your mid 40s to your early 50s, we'll undergo what's called a midlife crisis, whereby you sort of freak out, and people who have a stable home life and a good solid career freak out and go out and buy a Porsche or have an affair and blow up their family. Now, certainly sometimes people engage in reckless behavior. Evidence for there being a sort of a consistent midlife crisis stage that we go through, there's really not a ton of evidence for that. We do see that life satisfaction and happiness does fluctuate around a little bit. For example, when people get married, they tend to report being happier. Happiness takes a dip around when children are born. Happiness and satisfaction with life and with relationships rises a bit when children are school aged. Really, again, despite the fact that adulthood does see a lot of changes, most people are not going to have a severe existential crisis at the age of 50 and all of a sudden freak out and blow up their own lives. Again, everyone's different. Some people might have more struggles once they reach this age. People go through divorce, things do happen. But again, there's no consistent evidence that a midlife crisis is a natural developmental stage. And then finally, if you're lucky, you make it to a ripe old age. So, old age, the process of aging and what happens to us as we grow older, is its own entire field of what we term gerontology. So, gerontologists study the natural progression of aging, what it's like to be old, and how we can help people when they reach an old age. Now, old age is going to be a stage where there are certain problems associated with the fact of aging. So, it certainly is the case that for some, physical health declines and cognitive health will decline. It's not necessarily a foregone conclusion, though, that we reach a certain age and all of a sudden our bodies and our minds fall apart. That's really not true. Certainly, certain health problems become more prevalent when you're older. Things like Alzheimer's do affect older people more so than others. Jade, I'm almost done here. Jesus Christ. Go play with your toys. Okay, I'll pick you up. All right. So it is certainly the case that your physical health will eventually decline as we reach the end of our lives, but it's not, again, I'll say, not a foregone conclusion that you're going to lose your health and you're going to lose your mind at any particular age. People are living longer these days, so it's naturally going to be the case that we do see certain physical and cognitive health changes as people live longer, which is why the field of gerontology is trying to understand the sorts of issues that arise as people live to older and older ages. So, Despite the fact that it certainly is possible for your physical health and cognitive health to change when you're older, it's not necessarily going to happen at any particular time or in any specific way. Plenty of people live to a very old age, and up until their death, they're physically healthy and of a sharp mind. Another major issue that tends to affect older individuals is the idea of isolation and loneliness. So, loneliness among the elderly is a huge problem in terms of their psychological health and well being. So, even if your physical and cognitive health would remain intact, loneliness and being isolated, having the people around you that you love pass away, possibly being isolated in a nursing home. This is certainly a problem among the elderly that has the possibility to cause a significant amount of social isolation and loneliness. So, depression is certainly a concern among the elderly. Depression, in and of itself, is highly detrimental to your physical and psychological health. So, the fact that older individuals often do feel a sense of isolation that can cause depression, this, I would say, is a big problem, and we do need to make sure that we're paying attention to the possibility that the elderly among us do need to feel included, and we do need to make sure that they don't feel isolated. Now, according to the Erik Erikson psychosocial model, he speculated that old age, the issue that individuals who reach old age would be grappling with is this idea of integrity versus despair. So it's a bit of an existential sort of a conflict. The idea that as you reach old age and you reflect on your life's experiences, you can look back and you can feel that you were a person who lived a good life, that was a good person, did meaningful things, and basically that you can go out proud of yourself and that you lived a good life. He speculated that those who don't meet that sense of what he termed integrity may fall into what we would call despair. So, when you don't feel like you accomplished what you wanted to do in your life, when you feel like your life lacked a sense of meaning, he predicted that you might fall into a state of despair and depression. So, whether or not there's solid support that this is the exact existential crisis that occurs among the elderly, again, there's some support for it. Definitely, I think that issue I just raised about the idea that elderly people are at risk of isolation, loneliness, and thus of depression, I think speaks to the idea that this is going to be a time of life when one is able to reflect on what one has accomplished. And if you feel lonely or sad or depressed, it certainly could be the case that the conclusion you come to at this stage has negative existential and mental implications. Now, I would say that despite the fact that everyone's always talking about being afraid of growing old, and even friends of mine, we're all in our 30s, are always freaking out about how old we're getting, I would encourage you not to really think of it that way. Growing old is really a blessing. Um, you get to experience a whole wealth of things and people and places. Living a long life really just affords you so many more things to learn and to experience and to enjoy. So, living a longer life is better because if you love life, you want to experience it. So, really, living longer, I would say, is a good thing. So, don't fear aging. It's just giving you more time to experience the blessing that is the world. And as my mom always told me, it's better than the alternative. We all fear death, and I would say all of us would like to put it off as long as possible. So, I would just encourage you to not fear old age and don't fear aging, the changes that you undergo. And please, oh God, you college age people, don't talk about how old you're getting, because you've got hopefully a good long life ahead of you to experience lots of wonderful things. So, again, the study of old age is important. It's important that we care about the elderly. It's important that we pay attention to their physical and psychological health concerns. And I think we can all just hope that we make it to a ripe old age ourselves. Okay, so that'll do it for me today. We'll have a discussion tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to it. I'll talk to you guys soon.